Hey guys, it's Cody with After 5 Outdoors. Today, I'm doing a very cool interview. We're going to be doing a video all about bears and bear biology. And this is Andy Try, and he's from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and he's the Bear Project leader.
That's right.
So we're gonna talk about a bunch of stuff today, just bears in general, diets, habitat. Like, we're gonna cover the whole gamut. So there's gonna be a lot of information here. Probably gonna be a little bit longer of a video. In the description, I'll try and chapter it. So if there's a specific part that you want to see, you can just go to the description and you can click on that, and it'll bring you right to it.
It all starts out in the den, and so cubs are born in about mid-January or so, plus or minus a couple weeks. But the hibernation is not really what a lot of people think about. It's not like ground squirrels or groundhogs or anything like that where they're out cold. The body temperature of the bear only drops about 10 degrees, and their heart will stop for up to 30 seconds. And so we were totally puzzled by this. This was some research done with the University of Minnesota's Heart Research Lab. And what happens is that the only time that the heart beats in the wintertime when they're hibernating is when it's pumping oxygenated blood. And so they'll breathe 2 or 3, maybe 4 times per minute. And so the heart will stop when they breathe in. It'll speed up, and it'll stop when they stop breathing. And so that's going on the whole time. Mom gives birth in mid-January, and she's not eating, she's not drinking, she's not defecating or urinating at all. It's a super clean den, and then she'll clean up after the cub's nurse. Clean up their urination and defecation. But in general, it's all done during that hibernation period. The cubs are born, they're about, maybe yay big or so, about a pound. So you imagine like a pound of butter.
Yeah.
That's it.
Wow.
And blind, or I shouldn't say blind, they're born with their eyes closed, of course, just like puppies. Then when we go visit them in about March or so, they're about 6 pounds on average. As you move farther north, sometimes they're a little smaller, 4 or 5 pounds. But in general, they're not much different than a 12-week-old puppy. And then from there, their eyes are usually open at that point. Their canines will poke through, and then all heck breaks loose for mom. And so the cubs will start climbing. They'll hang around the den for about a month and a half after we go to dens in the first and second week of March. And then they will stick around the den until all of the cubs know how to climb. That's really their only defense. And so that's usually mid-April or so, and then they'll leave the denning area and start their lives as bears.
What is a typical litter size?
That's a great question. So the scientific way to answer that is 2.6. And so you're never going to find 0.6 cubs,
Right,
of course.
right,
That would be kind of messy.
right.
And so what that means is more commonly you see 3 than 2. However, we've had as many as 5 in our Grand Rapids study area. We've had 4 very commonly in the Northwest. And then we got a picture sent to us 2 years ago in Crow Wing County with 6 cub heads that we were able to count.
Wow.
And so it's really staggering when you think about it, because those cubs will stick with mom all the way through that first year. They'll den up with her again. So you can imagine 7 bears in one den.
Wow.
It'd be like a cave, you know? And again, 6 is beyond rare. But yeah, they'll stick with mom all the way through that first year, and then all the way until breeding season again, which is May and June. It's just incredible to think that you can have these huge litters, and she can make a big enough space for everybody.
Right. I did not know that they den with their mother the second year. I did not know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's what we commonly call yearlings. And so once they den up with mom after that first summer and fall, then they become yearlings, and they'll stick with them until May and June. And so we get kind of a spike in nuisance complaints, and when folks don't pull their bird feeders down and trash away, it's usually those young bears that are learning to be bears and getting into trouble.
So like after that first year, they're born, and like that, going into that hibernation period the second year, what does a typical cub weigh?
It depends where you are. And so here in Grand Rapids, this is the kind of the heart of bear range, and they'll weigh anywhere between about 30 to 50 pounds. And that's March weight. And so you have to add, maybe 15% or so to get what they weighed in the fall.
Okay.
But in the Northwest, It's some of the best bear habitat in the state, as you're well aware.
Right.
And so there's agriculture and oak forest. And so some of those yearlings, the heaviest one we've ever had was 130 pounds near Plummer. In fact, the habitat is so good that the mothers are able to pour a lot of fat and nutrients into their milk. They're just bigger bears in general, and we'll get to that later. But we had one where we went to the den in mid-March, and the cubs were 13 pounds. You could put them on a tree and they would climb just fine.
Wow.
And that was, again, Plummer.
And that's basically can be all attributed to nutrition.
Yeah. It's there's a hypothesis now that's expanded in mostly in the deer world. There's some work going on in University of Wyoming where if you have a mom who's in really good shape, or and with bears, a fat mom, that really gives you a leg up in life. And so in the mule deer world, if you have a fat mother, those bucks a couple years later have much higher quality, irrespective of genetics, because they just got a leg up in life. And it's very, very similar with bears. So if you get a lot of milk as a cub, you're going to be a heavier yearling. You're going to be able to reach that minimum age to reproduce first, and you'll have a younger age of reproduction and more cubs in your lifetime.
Typically, what's like the mortality rate of those cubs throughout that first year?
Sure, it's so males have a lower survival rate than females. Male cubs, in general, males have lower survival than females all over the place. But about 85% of the female cubs will make it, and about 79 to 80% of the male cubs will make it.
So why would the males have a higher death rate, I guess, versus what would be the cause of that?
We don't actually know what kills cubs for each specific cause. Essentially, we see the cubs in January, and then next year we see them as yearlings. However, as with a lot of creatures, males are a little bit more adventuresome. Mm-hmm. The old boys will be boys thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I can think of a specific example where my predecessor was out walking with a few bears, and he was able to watch the cubs. The female cubs stick much closer to mom than the males do.
Okay.
The male cub was climbing a tree, fell asleep on a branch, fell 30 feet and died.
Right.
And so that if you are not as close to mom, you're more likely to get into trouble.
Right.
And so that's what we think happens, but we don't actually know for sure.
Okay, so we're kind of into like April, May now. We're talking about, they're getting out. What kind of happens next in a bear's life?
Sure. So if you're a little cub, you're going to be sticking close to mom pretty much all through till you den up again. But in general, bears that are not nursing, so not the cubs, they are this time of year munching green vegetation. And so that means skunk cabbage, clover, grass. Sometimes they'll go out into the wetlands and they'll pull grass clumps apart and eat that little white part right at the base of the stem. And that's actually quite rich in sugar. Additionally, if you have maple trees, they're going to be up those, munching the red maple flowers and the catkins and the aspen flowers as well, willow buds, that sort of thing. Those are not super nutritious, but they get them kind of through the interim. And then prime time for bears comes in the berry season. So there is a window of about a month and a half or so where green vegetation is no longer worth it for them to eat. They'll eat it if they have to, but it's kind of like when forage for deer and cattle, when that protein and sugar content drops and it gets more woody, they switch to other things. And so in this case, they go for ground wasps, and bees and ant larvae are like their favorite thing. So in Minnesota, we're super lucky to have a lot of different ant species, but the ones bears prefer the most are called the yellow lasius or the yellow meadow ant. If you're ever walking through the woods, have you ever smelt citronella? Not that you sprayed on yourself?
Right. I guess not off the top of my head.
So if you have, what that means is that the bears have found with their nose a yellow lasius colony and torn it open. And so the ants, I've crushed one up and taken a lick, and they taste kind of lemony. And biologists are odd ducks in general, right. So I freely admit that. But they also have that citronella smell when it's their warning pheromone that, hey, something's attacking us. But they don't sting. And so when you drive along the highway, those big ant mounds that you see in kind of the disturbed areas is a different type of ant, and those ones can sting. In fact, they're called formic or formica ants, those big black ones, and they can actually spray the bear in the face. They spray a chemical that'll burn. And so if you go and kick or disturb a big nest like that, of course you're going to get ants crawling all over you, and it'll hurt, and they'll bite you, but they'll also spray. So bears don't usually mess with those as much as they prefer those yellow lasius, but it's quite an interesting, they can make quite a living just on ant larvae for that interim period.
So like I know this is kind of a viewer question, but I just wanted to insert it when we're talking about this period. Do bears, are they predators of fawns in the spring? I mean, is that something that they're really looking for, or are they more focused, do you think, on vegetation?
Sure. So about 85 or 90% of their whole diet is based on vegetation, whether that's green vegetation in the spring or berries and nuts in the fall. But if they do find a fawn, certainly they're going to consume it. It's not as common as it is with, say, grizzlies out west, where you'll be able to watch a grizzly come down a slope and just knock out elk calves. But they do take some fawns. It's really variable based in the country where you are. So our forests are pretty dense. There's lots of hazelbrush and willow. And so that makes it harder for bears to find these fawns bedded down. But if you're out in, say, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, those parks are much more mature forest, and there's a lot less underbrush. And so something like 30% of the mortality fawns have are from bears out there. They have a larger bear population as well. But yeah, so they do eat some. If you go into the boreal forest, bears will be piled up on sucker runs. They don't eat them here, but up in the boreal forest where there's less food, they'll eat fish as well. So yeah, fawns are a part of it, but we have a lot of different predator species that fawns are, and a lot of teeth in the woods.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so as we get into about July 4th, that's when the first sets of berries come out. In the underbrush, the first plant that comes out is the wild sour sarsaparilla. And so I'm told you can make something that's similar to root beer. You have a sour sarsaparilla at the saloon.
Okay, sure.
But they have berries that come up in little stalks, and the bears will just eat those like crazy. In fact, we've had a few reports of bears just kind of with really swollen bellies and full of berries. It's the only thing that's essentially around right away. And then things give way to raspberries, blackberries, cherries, and then the rest of the summer berries. And
so, how much will a bear eat a day, like poundage wise? Is there any research into that?
It depends on how many calories per pound. And so during the summer, there's a whole wide variety of estimates, but probably between 6,000 and 8,000 calories a day just for maintenance, especially if your mom nursing all those cubs.
Right.
But that amps up and is a perfect segue to fall. So the minimum I've seen is 12,000 calories a day up to 20 or 25,000 calories a day. And that's something like 25 to 30 McDonald's Happy Meals a day. 12,000 calories is what Michael Phelps used for training for the Olympics. And it's over and above that. And so they have to eat a lot of acorns, and that's why they switch to more nuts in the fall. So acorns and hazelnuts are their favorite. But there are also berries available if they can't get to acorns, or acorns haven't dropped or are unavailable. Now
in our area, in the northwest part of Minnesota, cornfields, do bears like soybeans?
We have had reports of bears eating in the beans, but corn and sunflowers are the other ones.
Barley would be another one as well, right?
And then for corn, and actually with oats, when they hit that milk stage, they can really cause quite a lot of damage, because that's when the sugars are released, and the males especially can eat quite a lot of corn, and they'll make these big crop circles, as any farmer will know.
Right.
One thing we learned for the Northwest is the oil sunflowers are like number one king for bears. Once they learn what they are, we've done some captive feeding trials, and it takes them a while to figure it out. But if they had mom teaching them what they are, they can cause a fair bit of damage out in those fields as well.
So what would be the difference between oil sunflowers and...
Versus like confectionery? One would be the kind of sunflowers that becomes birdseed, or you make sunflower oil out of, and the other are the ones that you eat at the ball game. And so they'll eat both, but they definitely prefer... You can see if you have two varieties planted, they're going to hit those oilers first.
Because the oilers would obviously probably have more nutrition for them?
Far more fat, yep. What we found out in corn country is that bears will pound a couple rows and then leave the rest, and so some of those are experimental rows, and it's almost as if they can tell the sugar content, kind of like if you restore a wetland, those geese are going to hammer the ones that grew in the greenhouse and then leave the ones that grew there naturally.
Right. So we're getting into that late fall period now. Hunting season's coming up. The bears know that winter's coming. Old man winter's coming for them. So what does the bear start doing at that time?
Sure. So there's a mechanism in their brain that says, oh, probably should start packing on the pounds. It's totally innate, and we don't know what the mechanism chemically is, but somewhere in maybe the second or third week of August, things really change. And so in Minnesota, we have migrating bears. So we've had bears collared in the Grand Rapids study area since the early 80s. And essentially, they follow the acorns. And so bears from up north in Grand Rapids, Marcel, Big Fork, they'll migrate sometimes all the way down to Brainerd. So that's 120 miles or so.
Wow.
And it's more common in good years than bad. And it's really counterintuitive why they would do that. You'd think they would leave in the bad food years versus the good. But as far as we can tell, the reason they do that in the good years is if you imagine you're like Pac-Man, okay? You're eating those little pills across the landscape, in this case acorns, and you just keep eating because it's totally worth it to keep going. Conversely, if things are bad at home, you don't know what things are going to be like down south, and so the risk is you burn all those extra calories getting there and then find out it's just as bad.
Mm-hmm.
An added benefit is that with our system and the way that we allow baiting, if bears are moving and migrating, they actually are imparted a survival benefit. So the bears that leave are less likely to hit those baits in their home range and survive better than those that remain. And so on average, about half of the males leave in every given year, and about a third or so of the females do.
Now that opens up just a quick question. Bears, do they have typically do they have a designated their home range, or are they just kind of movers and shakers kind of?
They do have a pretty set home range. And so if you, for example, were to collar all the females, let's say in Marshall County, for example, you'd be able to plot all those points on a map, and it would look like a honeycomb, essentially. There is some overlap among home ranges, but in general, they all kind of have their own areas.
They are solitary.
They are solitary. And then you'd find males overlapping 2 or 3 females' home range. And so a home range for a female is about 10 square miles or so on average, and about 100 square miles for those big males.
Okay.
And so once they start that migration, either they'll go or stay. But they have to pack on the pounds, and so they'll start to shift their behavior as well. So they'll really start eating. They'll really target some of those late season things like acorns and American hazel. You guys have a lot of American hazel bush, and those create many nuts in the clusters versus the beaked hazel we have here, where the most you can get are like 3 or 4. I mean, you could get a dozen in a cluster out west, and so they'll hit those high calorie areas. Sometimes we'll also have issues with folks around Labor Day. If they don't clean up their trash, they'll hit the trash there because they just have to eat a lot of calories.
And I would assume that, I've noticed that in drier years we have more issues with bears in small towns, in garbage, bird feeders, things like that, versus this year now it's going to be a little bit tougher because we're kind of late, and we really haven't had the green up yet, at least in my part of the state. It's a little bit better here, but the ice isn't even off Lake of the Woods yet. So I would assume in years like that, it would be a little more, there's a lot more bear-human bad interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in years like this, or last year, that was one of the worst droughts we've had probably since the 80s. And so that's where it's super important for folks to just be really vigilant. Don't feed birds, keep your trash secure, that sort of thing. If you're growing corn, that's a whole nother ball of wax. It's really hard to secure corn. But yeah, when things are dry or springs are late, there can be some peaks in problem bear or nuisance bear behavior. But in general, that time of year in the fall, there's quite a lot of food, unless we've had a really dry year, and so they'll just pound the acorns like crazy. Unfortunately, acorn drop is usually right around the 1st of September in your neck of the woods.
Yep.
And so that really can slow down the bear harvest because they prefer acorns to bait.
Right.
But in years that are that where foods are bad, females that would not normally come to bait actually get drawn into the baits. And so there's kind of a two-sided coin here. And so in bad food years, more females are harvested than normal. More reproductive females are killed at a higher rate than they normally would be. It's equivalent to males. However, those that can avoid coming to baits during legal shooting hours get that super nutritious bait. I mean, lots of folks are using trail mix and really high calorie stuff. It's not the dry dog food, the grease, and the dried or the donuts anymore. Like, you can get a lot of high quality bait for relatively inexpensively, and that kind of evens out that reproduction boom and bust with those bad food years. Likewise, they will shift to nocturnal right around probably the second or third week of the season, and so luckily most hunters are done by then, but the hunting gets much tougher.
Right.
And if you're waiting for a big boar, they are smart, they shift nocturnal earlier, and they know what the game is.
I experienced that last year. What is there a scientific reason for that bear going nocturnal? Is it?
We don't know. It's not an issue of hunting or baiting or anything like that, because it happens in national parks as well, where there's no hunting allowed. It's just some mechanism that causes them to do that, and we presume it's just they need more hours to eat. So they'll eat, they'll take a rest, they'll loaf around, they'll eat, they'll take a rest, loaf around, and it's just more active hours during the day.
Does heat affect bear movement? And then water sources. Do they like to stick close to rivers? Do they like to have a pond somewhere in their area, and they can? I mean, is there any science behind that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a black bear, you're basically just one heat magnet.
Right.
And so when we're setting traps for research in June, we try to find a nice shady spot near a marsh or some sort of riparian wetland area. You guys are blessed with a lot of those in the northwestern part of the state. As long as you've got good DEET, then you're fine.
Yes.
But they tend to stick closer to, they'll use those riparian areas fairly extensively. And if it's hot out, they're going to be not far from a water source. The flip side is that a lot of the berry species, especially towards the end, there's quite a lot of water that's in the berry.
I suppose, yeah.
But they still obviously need to drink. And cooling off, they'll often kind of they'll either make a little nest on kind of a rise, sphagnum moss, that sort of thing, Labrador tea, and they'll just kind of take a nap for a while. If they need to really cool off, they'll jump in a lake or jump in a pond and roll around and get all wet, and that evaporative cooling really helps wick away some of the heat. So
we're into that hunting, or past that hunting phase, and I suppose we're getting ready to den up now, I suppose.
Yep, so after hunting season, that ends in mid-October for Minnesota. Then the bears are either denning up already, or they're getting ready to do so. And so in general, the chronology is females that are pregnant will den first. And I use the term pregnant loosely. So if you were to shoot a female bear during this season, she has a fertilized embryo floating around her reproductive tract, but it hasn't implanted yet. So it's a little different than like if you shoot a late, like during muzzleloader deer, they're not formed. Mm-hmm. But those embryos will implant in November typically. So the females that are going to be pregnant den up first. Then the females with yearlings or soon-to-be yearlings will den up next. And then the males are often out and about the longest. And so if you ever see a bear up in first week in November, almost guaranteed it's a male just out trying to get the last bit of calories. And so, as I was saying before, with breeding season in May and June, the males and females will breed, of course, and then those fertilized zygotes, which is just a fancy word for fertilized egg, they just float around her reproductive tract. And it's a process called delayed implantation versus there's another thing in ecology called delayed fertilization. And so the difference is delayed fertilization is the female holds on to the sperm and then fertilizes the eggs later, whereas with bears it's fertilized right away, floats around, and then just before Thanksgiving, sometime in November, probably during deer season for most of us, it'll implant. And then gestation starts. From there, they give birth in on around the 15th of January, so that gestation time is really short.
It's fast, yeah. Wow.
And we think the mechanism for that is everything for bears is based on body condition, weight, and food. Like food drives everything for bears, period. And so if you're a bear right on the cusp, for us it's about a March weight of about 120 pounds, so maybe 150 or so in the fall. If you're right on the cusp, it's not that big of a deal for the body to resorb the eggs, and then you just wait till next year. Whereas if you were to have those eggs implant earlier and give birth earlier in the winter, now you're carrying those little guys and girls all the way through winter based just on your fat reserves. And so the females are burning fat basically till they can start getting enough calories where their calorie balance is normal again. So it's a really substantial draw to create all that milk for 2, 3, 4, 5 little ones. Right. So it's just easier for them to resorb that zygote, and they can try again next year.
Now, when we're talking about reproduction, a sow, is there a average or typical age when a sow starts getting bred? I mean, do they usually? And there's always an exception to the rule, but is there an average?
There is, and bears are one of the most cool ones of species I've ever worked on. So I think that's one thing that the general public definitely does not know. And so of any mammal species in the state of Minnesota, it takes the longest for bears to reproduce. On average in Minnesota, it takes 5 years before they're able to have their first cubs. So in the most productive areas, like the northwestern part of the state, the transition zone, like Park Rapids, Brainerd, and then over to Sandstone, that kind of country, food conditions are sufficient enough where they can reach that minimum threshold to reproduce at 4. Some of them even breed at 3. But in the far north, what we've seen from our Voyageurs National Park bears is on average at 6. And sometimes we had a case of a bear in the bog up here near Grand Rapids. She didn't reproduce till 10. And she was, super tiny. And there's just not as much food in the lowlands as there is in the uplands, and she never hit bait. And so, year after year, is she going to reproduce? Nope. A lot of work to have a zero data point.
Right. So, is there kind of an age when they kind of stop reproducing?
Yes, but we have a very limited data set about that. So this bear, the bear that lived to 39 and a half, her number was 56, bear 56. And there's a cool article about her life in the Conservation Volunteer from back in 2014 if people want to read more about her. But she stopped reproducing at about 25. We've just not had very many survive to that point to know when they stop reproducing. Most bears, I think probably 10 is a good estimate for the average age of a bear that makes it. She was the exception to the rule, but we do have a few collared bears in protected areas down at Camp Ripley, for example, that are almost at that 25.
Really?
So we'll get a little more data that way to see.
Right.
Yeah, it's like clockwork. Once they have that first reproduction, it's every other year, basically until they're harvested or they die.
Okay, so that's kind of the general bear year in the life of a bear. Let's talk a little bit about bear management in Minnesota. Can you give us a little insight into how that kind of works?
So with DNR, wildlife are a public trust. So it's the public's resource held in trust by the DNR. And so we make management decisions to ensure that we have a healthy, resilient bear population. We manage bears through regulated hunting. I think a lot of people maybe don't know, if they're not in the hunting world, like how regulated these things are. Bears are super highly regulated in what we can do. Just for an aside, we tell you what you can shoot them with, when you can shoot them, when you can't shoot them, what you can feed them, what you can't feed them, what you can shoot them out of, where you can shoot them, how many you can shoot. It's super highly regulated, and it's very specifically with bears because they have that high age of reproduction. We got to be really careful and cautious when we're setting those quotas. But so in general, bear management in earnest started probably in the early 70s or so. So up through the 60s, bears were considered a varmint species, and there were some counties, I think Beltrami County was the last one to get rid of their bounty in 1965. It's hard to imagine, like the county is paying people to shoot bears all the way through 1965. It's just incredible. They would pay you for a sow if you swore an affidavit that you also killed the subs. Like some things that are totally unconscionable now were commonplace back then. Public sentiment had changed, and black bears were elevated to a game species from a varmint species in 1970 or 71. We didn't have a lot of information at the time. We didn't know a lot about bears. A lot of the research studies were just getting started or were to be started later on in the 70s. And so you used to be able to get one bear a year on your deer license, and then it was quite a long season. And so as time went on through the 70s, we kind of figured out, some of the basics, and it shifted to later in the year. And we started off with somewhere less than 10,000 bears in the 70s. The bear research project here started in earnest in 1983. We did collar a few bears ahead of there in the early 80s, but 83 is when we really got down to the brass tacks of it all. And so we started off trying to evaluate reproduction and survival, as well as density and how much harvest we can allot. And in 1983 or 1986, I believe it's 1986, we became the first state in the nation to offer a quota for black bear hunting, because we were already worried about overharvest. We didn't have super refined population models at the time. Bear research was at its infancy. We were dealing with the first iterations of VHF collars, very primitive anesthesia drugs at the time. And so we took a more cautious approach. Through that highly regulated management, so one bear per person per year with a lottery system and a fairly limited quota to start with, the bear population really started to grow through the 80s and the 90s, and it kind of peaked in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so along with this population increase, we had a couple of really bad food years. One was 1995. That's the worst food year on record, with the exception of last year. It wasn't necessarily due to a drought, it just was a statewide food failure. And in your neck of the woods, managers at Thief Lake and some of the more northwestern wildlife areas started seeing bears out in the crop fields, out in that prairie parkland region. And they were being pulled out from the Beltrami Island State Forest. And they found what they needed. At first it was just males, but after a year or two, females and cubs started showing up. And so once they're there, you have a population, and it's just been allowed to grow ever since then. It's always been a fairly cautious rate of growth, but that area has been no quota for basically since the installment of the quota system. Large land holdings, not a high human density, and it's really good bear habitat, and people are tolerant of them, and let bears be bears.
And honestly, there's a lot of area that's not populated in northwest Minnesota. So there's, except for in the spring and sometimes the summer and fall, depending on what kind of year we're having, our interaction's pretty low. Like, we don't typically have a lot of nuisance bears. I'm trying to think of the year, 4 years ago, probably. I do remember a lot of bear calls, stuff like that. But it's not real often.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you grow up in northern Minnesota, you live in bear country, and people have adjusted to it certainly well. I mean, people in northwestern Minnesota are used to living with wildlife and dealing with wildlife in different ways. And the bears have taken a foothold, and they are into North Dakota now. I mean, most of the Red River Valley has bears. Mm-hmm. You have bears all the way down to the 94 corridor. On the north end of the Twin Cities, there are small populations of black bears in far southeastern Minnesota, in that driftless country. As long as people don't shoot them and there's habitat, bears will thrive. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly a case of doing that. And so along those lines, 95 and then 2001 were kind of the turning point years for bears in Minnesota. At the time, we had a population model that said that bear populations were going to explode out of control of hunting. And so it was like a red full stop, red alert, we need to change how we're doing things. And so at the time, the agency decided to just issue out quite a lot of bear permits. And what we didn't know is the population had already taken a turn after 95 and 2001. In each of those years, about 5,000 bears were killed. So something like 25% or so of the whole statewide population was killed in one harvest. And what that did, unfortunately, is killed a lot of reproductive females. Just like when you're managing deer, like if you kill a lot of your does, the population recedes real quick. And so from the peak in 2000, the population dropped to a bottom in 2012 of about 10,000, 12,000 bears, essentially the lowest it had been since the 80s. And so we cut permits really far back, and they've been able to slowly recover since then.
So I remember the first year that I was, or the second year that I had moved back, I bear hunted in 2011. Wasn't successful, but I had a really nice bear coming in. But I remember, I think if I remember correctly, I could shoot 2 bears at that time. So, and that changed in about 12, 13, somewhere in there?
Yep, that's right. When we really clamped down the regulations, in the no quota, you used to be able to take 2 bears, and very few people actually ever took 2 bears. I think it was probably less than 10 or 20 hunters in any given year. And so you could essentially have 3 bears killed in a year, so 2 in the no quota and 1 in the quota. But if we're really rationing things back in the quota, it also isn't great that we're allowing 2 harvests out here. So we made it so people can hunt 2 bears, 1 in the quota, 1 in the no quota. And again, it's maybe 5 hunters now that do that in any given year.
Okay. So now, just talking about hunting, success rates throughout the state, I would assume my area has a higher hunter success rate than like Grand Rapids, Park Rapids, in that area. Is that the case, or?
It's actually the opposite. So in the old days, harvest success rates were probably around 20% or so in the no quota and in the quota zone. And that was just because there's lots of people competing over the same amount of bears. But as we've really cut down on the quota permits, harvest success rate across the quota in the last 4 years has been right around 50%, which is some of the highest in the entire country. There are pockets of the no quota zone up in your neck of the woods where success is probably close to that, but no quota wide, it's about 25 or maybe caps out at about 30%. As we've cut down quota permits, it seems logical, about half of the hunters in the entire state are hunting in the no quota. And so you think about how many times you've been out and about and how many bear hunters that you've seen up in the far northwest. I hate to say it, but this may get the secret out there that it's great bear hunting. But a lot of people are hunting in that kind of Nemadji State Forest, south of Duluth, that no quota line. Okay. And they pile in there, and there's lots of people. And everywhere else, you're not competing with as many people, so they have higher success.
Would you say that we maybe have the advantage a little bit because of crops as well?
Yeah.
But at the same time, maybe a disadvantage?
It's super hard to hunt corn. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Unless you're up in a JLG lift or something, or sitting on a silo or up on hay bales, it's really hard.
Right.
We're planting corn at a higher density than we ever have before. There's more acres planted in corn now, and I don't know if you've walked a cornfield lately, but when we were kids, no problem. But now you got leaves in your face, and it's just like a jungle. And so it's really hard to hunt bears out of corn. That said, a lot of these properties where people are farming, not all of it's tillable acres. And so those non-tillable acres are often that lowland, wetland area that's loaded with bear food, and that's just as good hunting. And so being that there's a lot of private land in northwestern Minnesota, not every farmer is letting every person on their land just by the nature of it's who you know, and that keeps the local hunting pressure and density down, and so you get higher success rates in those little pockets.
One very interesting thing that we had talked about prior to setting up this meeting, because we talked about a lot of different things, what to kind of talk about. We had talked a little bit about migration, and I was really amazed at how big of an area a bear can have. Can you touch a little bit about migration?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about migration, we mean that they leave and then come back. And so the first thing that's interesting about that is they don't always come back in that same year. So, for example, we had a bear three years ago. He lives north of Grand Rapids. He went down through Reamer and Longville, went all the way south to Pequot Lakes, and then all the way up north to Cross Lake, and then went all the way east to Deep Portage, so Longville area again, and then denned up. And then that spring, he came back and did his normal thing, his normal home range. And it's hard to imagine why they're covering that much area, and why they go where they go. We have some data showing that they have basically the same path, and essentially they'll start migrating on a path that they've never been before. Like, you can watch a cub get to a certain level and then they'll start migrating for some reason. Bears are solitary, so who's showing them the way? And so we think there's some sort of scent marking that happens. Bears have scent glands in their paws. They rub, they have glands on the back. And so presumably they're following the same tracks as everybody else, thinking, probably there's food somewhere. But it's a really different phenomenon here than what I would have anticipated initially. So generally the migration path from here in Grand Rapids is to the south and west, following that oak line and the Mississippi River. But we also get bears that migrate north into the swamp. Primarily it's males. We presume it's just to find some solitude for denning, but they'll end up in really, really odd spots. We had one male from Grand Rapids go all the way up to Net Lake, all the way west to Panema on the eastern shore of Lower Red. And then he denned up along the Gemmel Beach Ridge off of 71 there, just northeast of Northholm, just out in the middle of a swamp, 10 miles from the road.
No idea why
I have no idea why he picked that spot.
Huh.
But the next spring he came right back to Plantation Lake and hit the bird feeders on the western edge of the lake and did his normal thing.
Now, there was a bear that we had talked about that ended up actually in Sprague, Manitoba as well.
Yes, that's bear number 4103. So he was born to one of our females in Plummer, and he migrated and lived up in one of the big pools at Agassiz. So at Agassiz there's that wilderness area kind of in the north central part, and so he kind of lived in that big pool to the south of that. And he lived there for a couple years. We recollared him, or I should say we changed his GPS collar, and all of a sudden he took off. Straight to Kittson County. There are parts of Kittson County and Lake of the Woods County, in fact, where there's a decent amount of corn production. So they're like, yep, he's got to be in that ag field. But then he went to Canada, just Sprague Creek and near the town of Sprague, and then denned up there and decided that was a better place to be. Again, in the middle of a bog. No idea why he was there. Some bears in the bogs will den up above ground. They'll make a big nest. And this bear we almost stepped on. You couldn't tell him from the surrounding snow. If we had looked closer, we could see the snow kind of raising and lowering as he breathed, but yeah, really hard to tell.
So that brings up an interesting question. When we're talking about dens, bears don't always go like into the ground as we kind of think, like they dig out around a rock or a fallen tree or something. Sometimes they'll actually swath up stuff to cover them.
Absolutely. It depends on the local habitat. If you look on a continental scale, it's very different depending on where you are. So if you're out in the tundra, or in our case out in the muskegs and the bogs, they'll either rip down balsams or any sort of conifer, spruce, and make a nice nest, or they'll shred up cattails and make a big nest. It looks just like Big Bird's nest on Sesame Street. It's huge. I mean, just a huge donut, and it'll be sometimes this high on the sides or higher. In other cases, they'll dig underground, and we don't really know why they do which or the other, but we think there's some sort of trade-off. So if you're underground, it's certainly warmer when the winds are howling in January where it's 40 below than it would be up top. But you think about those beautiful ice fishing days in March where the sun's shining, you're finally getting some warmth, and we've drugged our research bears to be able to handle them, and you can feel the warmth coming off of that coat in March, and it's much cooler down below ground than it is above, and so they must be making some sort of trade-off.
Is there any research or science or anything to show what makes a bear wake up?
Very limited amount. We don't understand the mechanism. It's not really day length or anything. We think a lot of it's got to be moisture or snow melt, especially for those underground dens. One of the things that we've been so lucky to have is this denning data that goes all the way back to the 80s. As you'll remember from when you were a kid or when I was a kid, we used to have really cold winters. Mm-hmm. We didn't have these big thaws that happen in March. And so in the old days, we had far more dens underground than we do now. It's been a fairly noticeable shift. Both males and females are more above ground. And we think it's probably because we get those melts, and that tells the bear, hey, time to get up. You're going to be wet, and it's hard to get dry if it's freezing out.
And that would be something that I was thinking about this year. You know, some people were talking about they'd been seeing bears out, and I thought, wow, it's kind of early yet. But I was thinking, if they're denned in an area that's wet, there's got to be water getting in there, and I would imagine they wouldn't like that.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I believe there was a bear that showed up kind of on the corner in Clearbrook by the high school or the school there, and so they shut down school, saying stay away. But that was a situation likely where she denned in that culvert, and as the spring melt came, they came flooded out on the side of the road. And yeah, it's very odd. Sometimes they'll just like be hunched over, they'll just be totally wide open in corn stubble. It's like, well, that's your best spot, really? Right. That's what you would choose? And so some of these flashy flows in the spring can really be an issue for bears. We had one bear near Plummer. The Clearwater River runs right through Plummer there, and it can be quite flashy coming off when the melt comes off.
As it is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it can come up 6 feet in 24 hours. And so we went and set a trail camera and did our den workup. And I would say, I think there was a big melt that week, and maybe 3 or 4 days later, we got pictures of her rescuing her cubs, pulling them out of the hole. It had completely flooded in, and one of them was dead when she pulled it out. And so presumably it was hypothermia, and it just couldn't warm back up. Right. But the 3 of them still survived, and she denned right up on top made a nest right up on top until off she went.
Wow. It's really interesting how resilient and how intelligent that they can be. I mean, you think of them just as an animal, but there's so many things that they're just, in their brain that they know how to survive. Survival is the key. Speaking of survival, I can't remember if we covered this already, but typically an average age of a bear in Minnesota?
It's a tricky question to answer. In general, 10 is probably about average. If you look at the harvest information, that's kind of a biased sample. Younger bears and males especially are more likely to hit baits, and so they get targeted earlier. So if you look at the harvest statistics, the average age of a male bear that's shot every year is 2. What that means is half of them are 2 or 1, and half of them are 2 or older. And so there's a very wide range on those ages. And for females, it's 3. So half of them are 3 or older, and half of them are 3 or younger.
Do you have any information about the oldest bear taken in Minnesota?
I have some information. When the bears get super old, the lines on the teeth get really close together, and so there's more uncertainty with it. But every year we probably get 1 or 2 in the 30s. And in the most recent year, we've had, I think the oldest one I can recollect is probably 34.
Was that a male or a female? Do you remember?
Female.
Really? So you think the females tend to live a little bit longer?
Yes, they absolutely do. So males are more bold, and there's no predators for bears really in Minnesota. There really isn't much that'll consume an adult bear aside from humans. So they're a lot more bold. They hit baits more regularly, and they also fight with each other much more often. And so it's tougher to be a male than it is a female. Mm-hmm. And females are more wary, as when you're hunting, females are less likely to come in, except in that dire food situation, and much more wary because oftentimes they have cubs with.
Do you have any data for Minnesota about the largest bear taken?
This is a tricky one to answer. So in the early 80s, we used to have registered weigh stations, and in that case, it was about 650 or 675 pounds was the heaviest recorded weight up near Mizpah, which again, it was near ag. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I think there's 2 or 3 over 700 pounds coming out of the northwestern part of the state.
What, like in a black bear, from your knowledge, like nationwide, or what is like the cutoff point for a black bear in size? That's
another tricky one. So again, with bears, food is everything. And so if you're out, so let's say you're living in an area that's maybe not so great, high alpine stuff, you're probably talking, 175 pounds on average for a female, maybe 250 for a male. Here for Minnesota, 350 is spot on average for a big mature male, but they can range all the way up through 700, some even go to 800 pounds. Wow. Regularly in eastern North Carolina, that's peanut and corn country, they're churning out bears that are 800 pounds or more. And so that's kind of the super top of the top. But for here, a real massive bear would be anything over about 450 pounds.
Does that kind of stretch out like into Montana, Idaho as well, or is that kind of?
It all depends on the food of the area.
Right.
And so like even within Minnesota, the biggest bears you're going to find are in the no quota zone. Anywhere where there's oaks and agriculture together, the biggest bears regularly harvested are either in the northwestern part of the state or near Brainerd, Baxter, that kind of country. And then they get smaller and smaller and smaller as you get farther north, just because foods are not as good.
So in the management plan, do you have like an estimate of how many bears you have collared right now?
Yeah, so we have just under 20 bears collared statewide. We try to keep it around 30 every year, just because beyond that it gets super unmanageable. Yep. And then we use those right now it's primarily reproductive rates that we're after to help inform our population models. And then we take the harvest data. So when you have to send in a tooth from all your harvested bears, those get cross-sectioned and stained, and then we read them under a microscope, and that's how we get the age for your patch. But that also is the information we use to inform the model, population model that gives us what the population trend is doing.
So let's kind of jump into like a hunting question and answer type of thing, because I'm really thinking of a lot of questions right now. Do you see the trend of bear hunting in Minnesota? Are there more hunters, or is it going down?
Bear hunting is more popular than ever. So in the peak of bear hunting, we had roughly about 20 to 25,000 applicants per year, and that dropped all the way down to about 15,000 or so in the peak, the bottom over the last 9 or 10 years. But the last few years, we're at 20 to 25,000 applicants every year. So it's more popular probably than it's ever been.
Typically, how many bears are allowed to be taken from those zones? Do you have a number?
Sure. So our hunter quota is about 3,750, somewhere in there for the quota zone, and then we don't limit anything that happens out in the no quota. Okay. If you assume an average hunter success of 40% or 50%, that gets you around 1,500 bears or so in the quota zone. In general, harvest is somewhere around 2,200 to 2,600 statewide, but the last couple of years have been dry, and so harvest has been up around 3,000.
Okay. Do you have like an estimated total population of bears in the state?
We do. It's really tricky to model and understand bear populations because you can't fly to survey them. Yep. Cameras can be really deceiving. As I'm sure you know, when you put cameras on your bait, it may look like there's 12, 15, 20 different bears at your bait, but in reality it might only be 5 or 6. And so it can be really tricky to tell them apart. Even for me, that I look at a lot of trail camera photos. But our best data from the model suggests we have somewhere between about 12,000 to 16,000 statewide, and that includes both the no quota and the quota area. And
I suppose you do have to be kind of careful, because on those bad food years, your harvest goes up, so that if you were very liberal with the amount of tags that were let out, you could have a disaster. So it has to be. That's got to be kind of a tricky thing to be in charge of.
It's a little hair-raising when we get those first couple weeks of the season. So about 80% of the hunt is done in the first 2.5, 3 weeks of the season. And so we have a good idea what we can expect for the rest of the season. But we set our quotas in January, February, March to get out to the lottery so people can apply. But we have no control over what the foods will do in that interim period. And we have there's no valve that I can shut to shut the season down. And so, it can be a little tricky. So that's why we always err on the side of a little more conservative quota. I mean, folks can harvest, they can hunt every year out in the no quota zone. And so that's kind of the steam release valve for most hunters. But that's not always practical, like if you live in Grand Marais or whatever.
Right. So if you're out hunting, and you have a bear come in that has an ear tag, I guess the reason behind this question is in our trail camera photos, we've had a lot of bears come in with one tag, some with 2, some with a collar, some with all 3. What can you tell us kind of what the purpose is of the ear tags? Like, is there a difference between, hey, this bear has 1 and this has 2? this one has both collars. And is there a reason behind all the different jewelry?
Yes, there's definitely a method to our madness. So the first thing people think of when they see a tagged bear is, okay, nuisance bear. We do not do any nuisance trapping of bears at all. We got out of that business about 20 years ago because moving the bear sometimes moves a bear who's going to get into trouble to another area. So that's not great. So that's why we don't do that anymore. But other states do, and they tag, and so that's what people might think. So the only time we tag a bear for DNR is when we handle it. And so if there are very small ear tags, like an inch by a half inch, that just means we've handled the bear. Go ahead and shoot, no problem. If the bear has ear tags that are similar to cattle style ear tags or sheep style, so they're either 3x2 or 2x2, that means that bear is collared usually. There are a few occasions where the bear is smarter than us and can slip the collar off or they lose too much weight. But in general, if they have big ear tags that if hunters could pass on those, that would be wonderful, because those are the bears we use to monitor for reproduction and help set quotas. Generally, if you see big ear tags, that means collar.
Okay. Is there a danger, like if there's only 20, 30 bears that have tags? Has it ever happened where you've lost almost all those bears in a season?
There have been a few situations like that. So 2016 was a bad food year here near Grand Rapids, and we only had about 7 bears collared, and we had 6 of them shot. It does happen, and it is legal for hunters to take a collared bear. We just ask folks not to.
Right.
It takes a lot of effort to catch and collar a bear, a lot of time, a lot of miles driven. On average, we can capture a bear about 1 every 100 trap nights. And so for your viewers, essentially that means if you had 100 traps and set them all out for one night, you get 1 bear. And so as you can see, that's a lot of work for just 1 bear. And so if folks shoot them all, that's not great. But that's why we have 30 out there to, buffer ourselves.
Do you have different areas of the state where you go and collar them too then? Or?
We do. Right now, the only places with collared bears are north of Grand Rapids. So essentially from Grand Rapids up to Big Fork, and then east till about Highway 65 and west to the Leech Lake Reservation. And then we have another cluster of bears near Camp Ripley, Brainerd, Baxter, Little Falls.
Okay.
We did have bears in the northwestern part of the state, one up near Thief and one down near Plummer, but we've pulled all the collars off there. So if you see any bears in the northwest with tags, go for it, but please call us to let us know you shot it.
Right. How long has it been since you tagged bears up in that area then?
We were actively summer trapping and tagging bears up through about 2015 or so, 2016.
So we have a sow then that's got to be at least 7 years old.
Guaranteed.
In our area.
The last time we put out any new collars, at least in Marshall County, we did collar a couple of yearlings of a female on the northeast side of Thief Lake, I think in 2018, but we pulled all the collars off in 2020.
Is there any plans to collar or tag bears up there again?
If needed. What tends to happen is as you move from one study area to the next, you get overextended, and it's not a short drive up to the northwest, as much as I do love that study area so very much. But we did learn what we needed to there, looking at the westward expansion of bears and how far they can go. Right now, the main focus is reproduction. So we've had collared bears in Grand Rapids since the 80s. We've had collared bears in Camp Ripley since 1991. The Northwest project started in 2007 and ended in 2020, and then we just pulled the last collar out of Voyagers last year. We've been there since 97. So that way you can compare all of those areas in the reproduction. And so now we're kind of in the data analysis and synthesis.
Okay, so here's a big question. We got a lot of people that don't like hunting for whatever reason. How big of a role does hunting play in your bear management?
Sure. In general, it plays a pretty big role. That's one of the only ways we have to manage bears. So bears are a bit different. There's no place in the country that they're eating themselves out of house and home like vast overpopulations of deer certainly can, and they'll hit that carrying capacity. With bears, oftentimes society imparts a carrying capacity of their own. Like, this is the maximum level of bears we're going to tolerate, and we don't have a fixed window for that. Obviously, the peak at 25,000 back in the mid or early 2000s was too much for folks to tolerate. There was all kinds of property damage, crop damage, that sort of thing. But we want to be higher than we are now, which is kind of the bottom starting to increase. And so essentially it's the Goldilocks principle of trying to find the right spot of minimal property damage, provides some sort of regulated hunting for folks, and then just allow people to see and encounter bears. In general, if bears didn't cause damage at all, we could have 100 times as many bears as we do now, and it probably would be fine. But because bears do cause damage, hunting does play a role, and essentially it prevents the damage from escalating very quickly. We can essentially keep it at a status quo. Mm-hmm. Plus, bear meat, as you well know, is quite good table fare.
Yeah. Depending on the diet.
Depending on the diet, certainly. Or if you're talking fall versus spring bear, obviously we don't have spring season here. But the fat is quite good for a waterproofer, as well as some of the best baking lard that you've ever had. If you've never had a pie crust or blueberry muffins made with bear lard, that's really
highly
good.
Recommended.
Yep. But you don't have to hunt bears to enjoy them. Personally, I don't hunt bears. I've just had a lot of encounters with bears in the field, and it's just one of those species that I don't target. I have no disrespect for anybody that chooses to target them, and without the hunters, we would not have that tooth data to be able to manage the population as effectively as we do.
Another thing we're talking about that's very controversial among hunters themselves, I get a lot of flack for it, baiting bears. We talked about it before we started this video, but there's a lot of people that really are anti-baiting. But in Minnesota, do you think in your opinion, with spending most of your time with bears, what would be the result of bear hunting success in Minnesota if baiting was prohibited?
Sure, it would certainly drop. To give a bit of a historical perspective, when the initial elevation of bears from varmint to game species were put together, once you have a new game species, you have to set those rules and regs. And so there's multiple ways you can go about it. Some states prevent baiting and running dogs. Some states are dogs only. Some states are bait only, and some states are any means of take. In fact, in Maine, you can hunt with dogs, bait, or trap bears if you so wish. And so the choice was made early on to allow baiting because our forests are far denser than a lot of places out east. If you walk out in the forest in Pennsylvania, it's like a park. And aside from some greenbrier, you're just not gonna, I should say there should be some rhododendron, you're just not gonna have really brushy forests. Well, here you can't walk 30 feet without getting whacked in the face with hazel. And so your ability to take a safe, clean shot would drop to almost near zero, and you'd have to be driving bears, which, doesn't really work for a habitat type. Additionally, if you have bait there, it allows the hunter to take their time and make an ethical, clean kill right away, and puts inflicts the least amount of pain and suffering when they take that shot. And all sportsmen want to do that.
And I think that another thing about baiting is if you're sitting on the ground or an elevated position or whatever you're doing, you typically have a look at that bear before he gets there. In my opinion, and the guys that I hunt with, we don't want to take sows. I mean, we do not want to take sows. Mm-hmm. We have a good opportunity to ID that bear and, pass or not pass. So I think that's another thing that's probably very beneficial about baiting.
Absolutely. Being able to take that time and identify your target is really important. It also saves some of our bears that are collared because you can see those ear tags. That said, one of the benefits from using bait that I think a lot of people don't know about, and we're just learning this now, in hindsight it seems so logical, but in bad food years, we do have a higher rate of females being killed over bait than normal. However, if the females are smart enough to avoid the baits during the day, during legal shooting hours, they actually get a supplement, and so they would be able to carry out a pregnancy they might not be able to because it's a bad food year. And so essentially it's kind of a moderating force in the forest, at least for bear population dynamics. Now, I'm not advocating that, supplemental feeding of bears to supplement the population, but it is another thing that, an unintended consequence that that happens. And the other thing is the types of baits people use, I think, is more variable and higher quality than people think. When people say, hey, I'm baiting for bear, they think you're lined up at the grocery store getting day-old donuts and stuff. And based on our hunter surveys, the bulk of people are using really high quality bait and things that replicate what bears would normally be eating. A lot of fruit, a lot of nuts. Trail mix is very popular. You definitely want to avoid things with chocolate, especially dark chocolate, because it can make the bears sick or kill them eventually if there's enough dark chocolate. But oats, grains, that sort of thing. And it's not an expected thing that bears would normally encounter, but given the situation, if we want to have this regulated hunting, this is one way we can go about it.
So you brought up an interesting thing when you said dark chocolate. What are some foods that you would strongly urge bear hunters in Minnesota not to use as bait? Are there some that are just very toxic to bears?
The main thing would be dark chocolate. And so the data on this are rather sparse, but there was a situation in New Hampshire or Vermont, I believe, where they came across a bait station where there were a couple bears that had died. And the necropsy showed it was an excessive amount of a chemical called thio or thiobromide. And so it's essentially the same chemical that makes dogs sick when they eat chocolate. And because it was dark chocolate, it has a higher level of that chemical. And it had a large quantity of this bait. And so they consumed a lot of it. And basically anything that, what I would recommend would be try to pick something that would more closely match what they would be eating. So if you can get a bunch of bulk cherries or apples, or like I mentioned before, trail mix, ideally without any chocolate. Milk chocolate's okay, but try to keep that as minimal as possible. You can do oats and corn and that sort of thing, but basically you want to, ideally, if it were me, I would just go for nuts and grains. Okay. So, one other thing, this is more anecdotal than what I've heard, but out east, especially in Maine, a very popular bait is to just hang a beaver, and so you get that castor lure, and bears do consume beavers in some part of their range, but in general, trying to avoid a lot of meat products at your bait is good for two reasons. One, having to sit over a meat pile, it smells so awful. In this state, you're not allowed to have whole carcasses and meat with bones in it. Mostly that's just due to aesthetics and other users of public lands. But the other thing to think about is the wolf and coyote aspect. And so aside from wolves taking the occasional small yearling or cub or something, generally once a wolf pack moves in, the bears will move out. And so if you have a lot of meat in your bait, you're more likely to pull in those canids, and they will defecate and urinate all over the place, and a bait will just go cold, and the bears won't come back for a while. And so at that point, you have to abandon the bait site and start over, and that already puts you behind in that really tight window when you're doing prime amount of bear hunting, that when we get most of that harvest in.
Does there get to be a competition between bears and wolves at any point in time, really, for, even though the bear's diet is a lot of vegetation, does there get to be a little bit of a struggle for territory ever that you guys have really noticed?
Not really. When a wolf pack moves in, the bears will kind of just avoid the area. Wolves can't climb trees, and so bears are perfectly safe from wolves. They'll just climb right up. The cubs and the yearlings, or the adult bears in general, will just climb and wait them out. After some point, it's just not worth it for the wolves to stick around. But in the bait situation, some of the findings from the Voyageurs Wolf Project up north have found that wolves consume a whole heck of a lot of bear bait. And so the competition maybe it isn't competition per se, but essentially once wolves moves in, your bait's going to go cold for a while, and either you have to get the scat out of there and the scent out of there, or just start over at a new place.
Bear sense of smell. Do you have a little bit of information on their senses?
Sure. So they have an incredible sense of smell. Just bears in general. I was just talking with a buddy of mine who used to go up and do goose surveys up in the high Arctic. And so they were near Churchill, Manitoba, and they were grilling out on top of a building and said, watch this. And so, you could see about, because it's so flat, you can see about 10 miles and you can see a polar bear right on the horizon. And they lit that grill and they were just flipping burgers. And you could watch that polar bear come in for 10 miles. And then it came right to the bottom of that building. We don't know, relatively speaking, how well the black bears smell similarly to polar bears. But the vast majority of our black bears from the Voyageurs National Park study area, the ones that do get harvested swim across the lake. And so they'll swim across Lake Kabetogama, presumably to get to the food on the other side, whether that's plums or cherries or whatnot that's available. And that's about 5 miles just on the breeze where that scent would carry. And certainly our forests are more dense, so the scents won't carry quite as far, but certainly a mile is no big deal for a bear to smell things.
Now, I've always heard a bear can't really see that well, but they can hear very well. Is there any truth to that?
From what we know, and it's hard to ask a bear, they don't talk, but their eyesight is about like ours. I don't know quite what the levels are for color vision versus, like a dog, but in general, their visual acuity is about what ours is, and their hearing is much better than ours.
We do have another section here of some of the questions that you guys asked. I put out some things on social media and also made a video actually asking for some of your questions. So I've got a few here, so kind of want to rapid fire some of these questions to you. Number one, why is there not a spring season in Minnesota?
Sure, we do get this question at least once or twice a year. And so right now, with the population recovering, there's just no need for extra harvest. And there's a lot of people in, for example, permit areas 45 and 46 that are waiting 4 or 5 years. And so in general, because of the way our bear traditions have gone, our bear hunting traditions, we just figure it would be easier and more equitable to put, if we need more harvest, to put those into more permits so folks can hunt more often. In general, there wasn't a spring season early on because it targets bears at their most vulnerable. And so, states out west and states in Canada have much larger bear populations than we do. And they can manage this whole females with cubs thing a little better. If you think about it, those cubs are 100% reliant on mom. And so if there's a mistake, and for example, a sow is taken, those cubs will die. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. They just won't survive. And so early on, that was one of the main concerns. It's one of those tools. We decided what would be, what we think would have the longest sustaining effect on the population, and what Minnesotans felt was most ethical and efficacious. And that's why we resolved on a fall hunt where we allow baiting.
What are some of the general, very distinguishable characteristic differences in males and females?
Sure. So you've asked the $1 million question, and it's very hard. I will freely admit it's very hard. Even for me, where I see a lot of bears every day, when I'm out in the field. There's a few different ways. Size is the biggest one, and so you can't really tell small male bears apart from females. But if you have a really big bear, and so when I'm talking, if you have a bait barrel on its side, if their belly is, or I should say if they're standing well above that barrel, you probably have a big male. But in general, you can go to all kinds of internet resources and kind of look at these things. But if you have just a large framed animal, in general, they're kind of square. Those are usually a male, and then females are more delicate shoulders and a larger rump. And so they're more pear-shaped, I guess. If you can watch them a long time, males urinate forward, females urinate back based on the way their genitalia are. Some people suspend baits and then put a trail camera down, and if you can see genitals, that's a dead giveaway. And sometimes if you have a trail camera near your bait station, sometimes the males will have kind of a furrowed brow once they get to maturity, but it's really tough. If you're looking at the skull, you can kind of look at the shapes. So big, mature animals, and mostly males, they have big round heads, and it looks like their ears are farther down on their head. Young bears, especially, and then females, oftentimes will have their ears slightly up. And if you draw a triangle between the ears and the snout, the small bears and the females will have more isosceles triangle, versus the big males will be more equilateral. So it'll look more like a pyramid on the big bears versus a thin triangle, or like a funnel on the small bears. But it's really tough, and if I could figure it out, it would certainly make my research trapping much better, because we're targeting females. Right. But it's the main piece of advice I can give to any hunter is just take your time, watch very carefully. If a bear is coming in with a group, it's almost always a female. Whether it's coming in with her, sometimes I've seen them eat with her yearlings from the year before. Otherwise, those are the cubs of the year.
The next question is the bear population in southern Minnesota, is it on the rise?
Yes, depending. So it depends what you're calling southern Minnesota. If you're talking about bears outside of normal primary range, then yes. So we have bears now in Anoka County, Chisago County, Stearns, Sherburne, all the way up into the Red River Valley. I wouldn't consider Red River Valley southern Minnesota, but basically south of that normal zone. That said, there is a small population of bears in far southeastern Minnesota, in that driftless country. Really good trout streams, by the way, and good turkey hunting as well. So it's a beautiful place to visit. But there are bears down there. I would estimate probably 20 or 25. That's just a total spitball. We have no population information, and only 2 have ever been harvested down there. So yes, but we don't exactly know how many are in that far southern part.
So the next question was, did wolves affect bears? We talked about that a little bit, and relatively, there's not really a whole lot of competition between the two.
Not really. At least there's no population level effects that have ever been documented. Now, certainly there are pictures out there, and there are anecdotal reports of wolves taking bears. But for example, in the den, that's when they're most vulnerable. We've worked up somewhere close to 5,000 or 6,000 den workups over the last 40 years, and in only 3 cases have the wolves messed with bears to the point where it would have killed them. We had one situation where its ears and nose has been gnawed off by wolves. Another, they were in a kind of exposed stump, and basically from the battle, all that was left was just a hole in the ground. The stump was completely shredded, but the bear was fine. And then in a third case, it was a solo 2-year-old and in an open nest, and all we did was find a chewed collar, and so we presume wolves had gotten that as well.
And we talked again a little bit about the biggest documented bear in Minnesota is a little over 700 pounds.
Yeah, that's about right. The last few years, there have been some really monster-sized bears pulled out of that northwest country. We don't have official weigh stations, so the last recorded heavy bear was somewhere in the 600 pounds near Mizpah. But that also, we don't keep track of Pope and Young or Boone and Crockett records either, and so that's just a different way to measure that bear.
Okay. One of the questions I had from a viewer was about predation of fawns, and we talked about that a little bit too, but not really a lot. And what the bear's primary diet?
Sure. So there have been a few research studies on fawns in Minnesota. Most of them have either been up in the far north by, so like Elephant Lake or up near Ely, and then some here near Grand Rapids. And in general, bears will take fawns, but only about in that first week or so of life. After that, those fawns are, lickety split and quick, and it's just not worth it for the bears to try to take them. That said, if they do find a fawn bedded down, certainly that's a tasty snack that's not that hard to eat. Additionally, there's some evidence that in limited cases, bears will take moose calves as well. But based on the last bit of research, it's still a very small proportion relative to all the other sources of mortality for those critters.
Something I just thought of, is there a lot of reports or many reports at all of bears taking livestock?
Not really. That's much more common in the Southwest, especially where it can be quite dry. When I worked in Mexico, in those pastures that aren't kept open, where bears have screening cover, they'll often, pull calves underneath the barbed wire fence where they can get away with it. But in general, most of the time, there's not a lot of livestock taken. we'll occasionally get reports of bears breaking into chicken coops or taking goats or a few cows or something, but it's not a lot of reports every year.
So as far as one of the last questions here was questions on bear cubs and like the survival rate. Is there a, obviously you can't be out there to document every bear, but is there a guesstimation or an estimation on the percentage of survival of bear cubs?
Sure, we do at least have that. We don't necessarily know what kills bear cubs. You know, there's lots of things that can happen in the course of a year, but we do track cubs from birth, and then we see them again in the den the next year. And if they're not in the den, we presume it died. And so in that case, it's about 79% survival for the male cubs and about 85% or so for the female cubs.
So it is fairly high.
Yeah. Bear survival in general is incredibly high. And, you know, if you think about all the sources of mortality across the state, if of all the sources of mortality, about 75% is made up of hunting. And so that's good and bad. And so it's a good thing because we can control hunter numbers. Like, as an agency, that's not a big deal. If we're killing too many bears, we pull those quotas back as we have done in the past. It just often surprises people that even in like Voyageurs National Park or Camp Ripley, where there is no bear hunting, hunting is still the largest source of mortality because these bears move long distances, and once they step off those protected areas, they are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. And our last question here, why is there such a low quota number in Zone 12? Sure.
So there's a couple things going on in 12, and maybe I should back up a little bit. So we manage populations based on trend and not actual bear numbers, because it's exceedingly difficult to give you like, hey, how many bears are in Marshall County? I couldn't tell you. You know, I can give you a range, but there's all kinds of assumptions with those population models. So it's often simpler in the population model to go at trend, and so that's what we do in general. And so the reason why Bear Management Unit 12 has had such low permits the last couple years, and then we decreased them this year, is that the population is declining based on our population model at the current harvest levels. And so when that's the situation, we have to turn it around and stabilize, because we don't want things to drop any further, or else that will result in further quota drops. And so it's a little bit of pain now for more opportunity later.
Hopefully you found this video informational. We covered a lot of things. I think there's probably a lot of things that we could still cover. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. A huge thank you to Andy Try and the DNR for letting this happen. This was really cool, really informational. I greatly appreciate it. Hope you guys liked it. If you did, please hit that thumbs up. We're going to do another quick video on bear number 56. That was the oldest bear ever recorded in Minnesota. And he's going to give a little, as much history on it as you can. So hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you on the next one.